Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. This is the Q3 webinar for the Affordable Solar and Storage Pre-Development and Technical Assistance Solicitation, or Pre-Development Program for short. I'm Dylan Cunningham, and I'm an assistant project manager on the New York-Sun team here at NY-SERDA, and today it'll be myself and Chris Rogers, who is also on the New York-Sun team and the lead of the pre-development program. Before we get started, I'd like to just share some webinar housekeeping. Everyone will remain muted during today's webinar, and if you have a question or comment, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom right-hand side of the WebEx, and we have carved out time at the end of the webinar to address those. We are also recording today's presentation and we'll post that as well as this presentation slides to the pre-development program webpage for your reference afterwards. And all of that will be included in a follow-up email when all of that is available, typically in a few days, but no more than a week after today's webinar. And then something else that I'll mention is that I highly encourage everyone to take a look at the presentation slides after they're posted. We have some slides in the appendix that cover information about other NYSERDA programs and resources for multifamily buildings. We also have reference to a federal program in there as well that you may be interested in. And lastly, I'll provide some background on the webinar series. We started this with the goal of creating an open and ongoing platform to share information and answer questions about the pre-development program. So today's webinar will start with sort of an overview of the program, followed by all the program updates, supported activities, how to apply, and then that time for questions and answers. So now I'll hand it over to Chris for the rest of the presentation. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Dylan. And next slide. So starting things off, just to make sure we're all on the same page, just a quick overview of what New York-Sun is. New York-Sun is the overall incentive structure that provides incentives for new grid-connected solar projects. Currently, we're working towards a goal of 10 gigawatts of distributed solar by 2030, which is the key deadline for most programs and support, including the pre-development program, but as well, or also including the baseline megawatt block incentives that all projects that are working under this program would also be applying for. The other key term that you may see in different filings from New York-Sun and from NYSERDA references the solar energy equity framework, which just speaks to the broad range of programs that are focusing on directing benefits to disadvantaged communities in accordance with the Climate Act, which sets targets for the overall goals at a minimum of 40% of benefits must go to disadvantaged communities. The pre-development program is a key component of that. Next slide. And to speak about the pre-development program, it essentially, as I mentioned, since the goal of 10 gigawatts of distributed solar is by 2030, the pre-development program is intended to incentivize projects, a select group of projects before that deadline, which is why we have the end date of the end of 2029. The grants themselves, they're intended for essentially community-led projects that are focused on low to moderate income households, as well as regulated affordable housing, providing grants of up to $200,000, which are scaled depending on the scope of the benefits to the affordable housing, regulated affordable housing, or the low to moderate income households. The grant applicants themselves, typically they've included a range of community-based organizations as well as municipalities that have either a direct relationship, they are responsible for regulated affordable housing, and they have large constituencies with affordable housing or low to moderate income households within their communities, as well as organizations that are working in close partnership with entities that do have that criteria. Next slide. The broad review process, and part of the reason why we're having this webinar, applications are reviewed on a calendar quarterly basis. The applications are reviewed within the order of their submission, but the overall notifications and the process for reviewing them occurs after the end of each quarter. The one that's upcoming will be at the end of this month, September 30th, 2023. The following one will be December 31st, 2023, followed by March 31st, 2024, and so on and so forth. During the review process time, there may be additional information and clarifications that are requested from the review applicants, and then there are notifications of awards that go out. The next slide is just a visual representation of the calendar quarterly submission deadline for when you can expect to see notifications for the status of your application. The next slide is focused on key terms for the program, which will be used throughout this presentation, as well as anytime you're looking through the solicitation itself when they're speaking to the key one is regulated affordable housing. There's a wide range of types of affordable housing that exist within the state of New York. The type of buildings that would be supported by solar and storage projects that are fundable and eligible under the pre-development program include the narrower category of regulated affordable housing. That is, there is some sort of oversight authority that has established income-based restrictions for a multifamily housing building. The most common ones at the federal level are housing and urban development. There are also affordable housing supported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as within the state of New York. There's New York State Department or Homes and Community Renewal, as well as within New York City, there's Housing and Preservation Development, and there's a range of different types of regulated affordable housing. The next slide, also terms that you will see within the solicitation itself, in which I will speak of, are about different categories of applicants, including technical service provider. So the sort of quintessential ideal applicant for pre-development funding are community-based organizations or owners, managers of affordable housing, or entities that, such as municipalities that have large constituents or are somehow involved with low to moderate income households or regulated affordable housing. But also different types of technical service providers may be hired through pre-development grants to provide support to those entities, and provided that they are in close partnership with the aforementioned municipalities, community-based organizations, those applications are also eligible. And so if you do not fit within the sort of municipality, community-based organization, then it will be important and incumbent upon you within the application to show that you are working in partnership with, that is alongside with one of those organizations. So if you're a legal or a law firm or some sort of other type of firm, that's the sort of partnership that the grant applications are looking for. Now moving on to the program updates. So there's just a few this time, starting with going through multifamily housing guidance from HUD. I just wanted to just take a brief moment. There's a lot of folks that have been following the Inflation Reduction Act, the process of determining how that support will come out to states. And I just wanted to flag for those on the line who are working with regulated affordable housing that there has been additional guidance provided that essentially it makes it clear that community solar projects that are supporting HUD supported regulated affordable housing will not cause any issues with utility allowances. In addition to HUD, there have been other agencies that have released additional guidance on the Inflation Reduction Act, some of which we're still waiting for so that we can have the sort of final determinations about how this additional funding, additional, I guess, the direct payment system would work, what the additional benefits would be for low income benefit projects. That sort of guidance has slowly trickled out as we obtain more firm versions of the guidance. We're looking for ways to add that into our outreach and add that to our website so that folks are aware of different ways, in addition to the pre-development program, that can benefit these sort of solar and storage projects that you're looking at. I think the big picture is just to flag for folks that while the pre-development program is focused on certain types of early stage development support for low to moderate income households and for multifamily affordable housing, there are other levels of support that have emerged in the last year from the federal government that would be very relevant. And going on to the next slide, this is one such program that I also wanted to speak about for those who are operating in Con Ed region. I just wanted to make sure that folks are aware of their Make Ready program. The Make Ready program is focused on providing funding support for the interconnection process for non-community distributed generation projects, essentially an on-site net meter project that solar storage project that is built on what they title affordable multifamily energy efficiency eligibility criteria. That's essentially the exact same criteria that NYSERDA has for the multifamily affordable housing incentive. It's if it's a regulated affordable housing, multifamily affordable housing property with some sort of oversight agreement or regulatory agreement with an oversight authority that would qualify. And if it will enter PTO by 2026, then Con Ed will provide funding support for those projects. And so if you are in the planning stages of an on-site net meter project within Con Ed, I would encourage you to look into the Make Ready program. The next slide shows what their proposed funding or levels of capital support will be for these type of projects. And so again, the purpose here is just to try to help or make folks aware that this is a key level of support, and this also addresses a gap that the pre-development program does not focus on. You cannot use pre-development funding to pay for interconnection costs, but this program, at least for those within Con Ed, if you're working on an on-site solar project, then this funding is available. The next slide that I wanted to touch base on just to make sure that, again, this is just sort of level setting to make sure folks are aware, because the megawatt block program and that structure is dynamic and those incentives change, and this would very much impact the type of projects that would be applying under the pre-development program. So for, again, folks in the Con Edison area, there is a sort of range of incentives that are available for projects that would apply to this. We call this a non-residential incentive. It's somewhat confusingly, even though this does apply to residential buildings or multifamily affordable housing. But currently, for projects that are under 200 kilowatts, the baseline incentive for that in Con Ed is currently $1 per watt. For projects that are in between 200 kilowatts to 1 megawatt, they are currently also receiving a $1 per watt incentive, and above 1 megawatt, those projects will receive 50 cents a watt. This is separate to the multifamily affordable housing incentive, which would increase for projects that have not received a community credit allocation. It would increase that incentive to either $1.60 a watt or $2 a watt if that is a community solar, community distributed generation project. But this is very applicable for projects that, the baseline incentive is relevant for a lot of projects that you see under the pre-development program, because this applies for projects that are built anywhere. And so if you build a community solar project that is going to be directly connected to multifamily affordable housing, low to moderate income residents within your community, it's this baseline non-residential block structure that you should be paying attention to. Next slide. I sort of gave a precursor to this. Just again, want to make sure that folks are always aware of the multifamily affordable housing incentive. This incentive is available statewide in the Con Edison region, the upstate region, as well as the Long Island region. The upstate Long Island region, any project that is built directly upon multifamily regulated affordable housing and directly on, that does not mean just perhaps a tax parcel that must be directly upon a residential building. If it is regulated multifamily affordable housing, then they will receive an incentive of either $1 per watt within the Long Island and upstate region. That incentive changes to either $1.60 or $2 a watt within the Con Edison region, again, for projects that have not received a community credit allocation. Again, just for your awareness, if you are working on projects that will be directly working with multifamily affordable housing, it would be very important for you to make sure that you're getting the maximum solar incentive from NYSERDA. This is entirely independent of the pre-development grant. If you apply for a pre-development grant and your application is rejected, if you create a new grid-connected solar project, you're still eligible for this incentive. A project that received an approved pre-development grant, there is no change to your overall subsidy. These are independent programs. They're intended to work together, though, and just making sure that folks are aware that this funding is available. And then the next slide, again, for awareness, just keep in mind, so this can be very relevant for projects that are applying for pre-development grants. There are additional considerations under the Inflation Reduction Act, including additional levels of funding that would increase the federal investment tax credit for solar for separate categories of projects that will likely if your project is eligible for funding under the pre-development grant, you necessarily should fall under one of these buckets. Either your project is located within a disadvantaged community, it is directly built upon regulated affordable housing, that is a low-income residential building project, or it is a low-income community project, or potentially these are projects that are built on different tribal nations and indigenous land. So likely, if you are applying for funding under the pre-development grant, you would be eligible for an increase on the base level 30% federal investment tax credit that would take it up to potentially 40 or 50%. The last point is, which is something I mentioned about, guidance that we're still waiting on, is the sort of direct payment structure. That is a key consideration, in light of the strong interest in folks who are developing projects on affordable housing for finding alternative ways of financing and taking advantage of looking for tax equity investors. The direct payment structure would, for any nonprofit, would likely cut that step out. And so that's something that I would encourage you to make sure that you're researching and up to date on. The next part of the presentation will be focusing on the supported activities of the program. And so in general, the pre-development grant activities, it's focused on the early stage development of a solar and storage project. So that's generally the planning stages. I think there's a lot of folks think of it in terms of a feasibility study, which, there's certain limited support for site assessment work, but it's more intended for helping organization find the appropriate team, find the appropriate partners, developers that they would like to work with, to issue perhaps solicitations, to find it's some sort of competitive process to find the right development team to work with, to sort of enable municipalities and community-based organizations to find what the appropriate model that you would be working under, and also to find out if there is adequate perhaps space and interest within your community in order to develop these projects. Next slide. I think some of the most success that projects I've seen under this have been sort of using the grants to pool interest and start to look at things such as an aggregated procurement model, where instead of just having, looking at developing a project on one building, the pre-development grant could help you do this sort of outreach to find all of the buildings within a particular neighborhood that might be interested in developing a solar and or storage project, and then taking it to the phase of getting the appropriate financing for that project. The next step of this presentation will be focusing on how to apply. So I wanted to state up front, we're in the process of making some updates to the application portal. Applications are done entirely online. Once you submit an application, you should get an emailed attachment that contains all of the materials that you submitted, which would allow you to review and see if there are any mistakes or errors. That would also allow you, if you would like, to resubmit the application so that you can make corrections and update those attachments. We are in the process of updating the online portal. There's an issue with a few of the links that are located in that, and so we'll be removing that. And so if you are in the process of submitting an application and you are having issues obtaining the key attachments that are required, please feel free to reach out after this presentation, and I'll make sure that you can get those attachments, and then also we hope to have this issue resolved in the future. And with that out of the way, we'll take a pause before the Q&A portion of the webinar, and I'll see, again, um, please add your comments in the chat function in WebEx, and once we go through those questions, we'll answer those in order. Sorry, I said the chat, but I think it's the Q&A function. Please add your questions there. All right. Seeing no questions, I think we'll move into the last part of the webinar. But feel free to, if you have any questions, feel free to add those, and we'll definitely circle back to those before the end. There's a question there about rules governing the transferability. What are the rules governing transferability of incentives? I guess to specify, do you mean the New York Sun incentive? There are rules that are laid out within the program manuals regarding the assignment of incentives for non-residential and commercial and industrial projects. So we do have, I'd have to double check on that. You are able to assign the payments, but I believe that is a one-time assignment process. I think after that, you might need to modify an incentive if it's, I guess in that instance, you're able to change the payment, but there are some restrictions, and I don't know if you're speaking to this, there are restrictions on the actual applicant and the developer changing themselves, or the installer contractor. That may necessitate a resubmission, but for grant awards, that's a little different. That would depend on the situation, on the overall changes on the project team, and where that application stood within the overall process. So if for instance, if an applicant applied for a pre-development grant, and in the process of reviewing that application, there were changes to the overall project team, then the review committee would need the chance to review what the impact of those changes are. If the grant had already been awarded, then there would have to be a more sort of in-depth process for reviewing the transfer of that overall grant award. I'm sure that answers the question. The question about how tight essentially how detailed does the scope of work need to be in the process of the application stage? I would recommend that it should just be a sort of a general outline, with the idea that the more detailed version there will likely be questions about what different steps are and the broad milestones along the way. And so if the reviewers feel that more detail is required, they can request that, but I wouldn't expect the scope of work in the application phase to have the same level of detail of the actual implementation of the project, especially because there are certain details that will likely need to change at some point and may change along the way. So it's better to start at a high level outline of what the major milestones would be along the way. In instance, if there's a plan for seeking out contractors and installers, then that step should be laid out. But you wouldn't say that, what the short list of contractors would be, and you wouldn't state, necessarily, there wouldn't necessarily be a definitive number or I guess you might state a targeted savings rate, but you might not commit or put at this stage that you would definitively be going with either a PPA structure or third party structure or I guess the full terms of maybe letters of intent that you would have entities sign. You just start with the broader, I guess the most general idea of how the project would be working. And I would say on the just going back to the question about New York Sun, the transfer of New York Sun and Granite awards, I would, please send me an email after the fact if there is a more specific question about an incentive or a grant award that is in existence that you are inquiring about changing, because I'd like to make sure that I get you the correct information there. And I think that's it for the questions. So wrapping things up, just as a reminder, you will continue to, following this webinar, there will be notification for those who have attended, and we will be posting a recording of the webinar on the pre-development website. We will also make sure that we post notice in advance of future webinars in the series, again, to make sure folks are keeping this program, in the back of their minds as an available support mechanism. Next slide. If you have not already done so, and I would suspect that you likely have if you join this webinar, please visit the Contact Us section on the New York Sun webpage. That would allow you to sign up for updates, not just on programs like the pre-development program that are focused on affordable housing, disadvantaged communities, but as well as for updates on the incentive changes, the megawatt block program, as well as new developments that the New York Sun team has going on. Next slide. And this is just a reminder, because folks sometimes sign up and they don't get the notifications, just to make sure that solar announcements, that's generally the most common announcement email that the New York Sun program goes out. Just make sure that's one of your contacts so that you don't get all of our notifications getting sent to your spam folder. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending. Thanks again, Dylan, for your help presenting. And please feel free to reach out to christopher.rogers@nycerta.ny.gov if you have any questions about the pre-development program, the multifamily affordable housing incentive, the single family LMI residential incentive, or any follow-up questions based off of the material presented here. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.